The summer of 1974 arrived in Florida like a held breath, the kind of season that hummed low in the distance, where time stretched and the air itself seemed to thicken. The town of Cypress Hollow rested quietly along the lake's edge, a watercolor pastel homes and slow-turning ceiling fans. In the afternoons, the cicadas screamed from the trees, their rhythm matching the pulse of the sun on the glass windows. You could taste the salt from the nearby coast when the wind shifted. You could smell the sweetness of orange blossoms drifting over the fences. Everything in Cypress Hollow looked ordinary. That was its charm. Nothing ever changed here, until it did. People still talk about how the light fell that summer. It had a certain color to it, pale gold, softened by dust. They say that was the last real summer before the town started aging. Children played barefoot on driveways, sprinklers painting rainbows across the lawns. Radios played soft rock, and news anchors read headlines no one listened to. The war had ended, and people wanted quiet. They wanted stability, and Cypress Hollow gave them that, at least for a little while longer. At the end of Larkspur Street stood the Hollis home, a pale green house with a narrow porch and white curtains always drawn against the sun. It was a modest house, smaller than the others, but something about it lingered in people's minds. Maybe it was because of the twins, June and Joni Hollis, two girls who seemed to move through the world as if tethered by a single invisible thread. They were 9 years old that summer, small and identical in a way that made strangers stop and stare, not because they were beautiful, but because they were perfectly mirrored. Same hair clipped to the same side, same dresses their mother sewed herself, even the same soft, deliberate way of speaking, as if one always waited for the other to breathe. Their mother, Margaret Hollis, rarely joined the neighbors outside. She was a quiet woman, polite but detached, her voice always a little too careful. People said she had come from Georgia after her husband died, though no one could recall ever seeing a funeral or a photograph of him. She spent her days tending to her small garden, and her evenings sitting by the window, watching the girls ride their bikes up and down the street. From the outside, the Hollis family seemed peaceful, almost fragile in their sameness. Inside the town's gossip, however, there were always small murmurs, questions about the father, about Margaret's odd hours, about how the twins never went anywhere apart. June and Joni fascinated the other children. When they played, they didn't invite anyone to join. They'd sit cross-legged on the curb, whispering to each other, laughing at jokes no one else could hear. They'd draw chalk circles on the pavement and sit inside them like it was a private world. Some said they had their own language, that if you listened close enough, you'd hear patterns in their laughter, mirrored rhythms, unfinished sentences completed by the other. Even their teachers at Cypress Elementary mentioned how they would sometimes answer questions in unison, or, more strangely, how one would flinch when the other scraped her knee. In a place like Cypress Hollow, difference was quiet danger. The neighbors smiled at the twins, but whispered afterward. Some said they reminded them of old stories, the kind told by grandparents about spirits that traveled in pairs. Others dismissed it all as small-town superstition. Still, when the twins rode their bikes past, people often found themselves watching until they turned the corner, just to be sure they didn't disappear. The narrator's voice, soft and deliberate, lingers on this detail. The way stillness can be its own kind of omen. You never notice it until it's gone. Back then, the stillness of Cypress Hollow felt like protection. The lake shimmered at the edge of the neighborhood, wide and lazy, bordered by cypress trees whose roots tangled deep beneath the water. On summer evenings, when the air cooled, the surface of the lake would mirror the sky so perfectly it looked like you could fall into another world. That's where the twins liked to go most, down to the water's edge, their reflections blurring as the light faded. They'd skip stones and count the ripples, making quiet competitions that never really ended. Sometimes Margaret would call them back just as the sun dipped below the trees, her voice carrying across the still water. "June, Joni, home now." The girls would always turn at the same time, their heads tilting slightly as if they shared one thought. Then they'd pedal home, their wheels glinting in the fading light. There's an image that people remember from that summer. Two identical figures riding side by side to the golden haze, their laughter blending with the sound of crickets. It's the last ordinary memory anyone has of them. Everything that followed, the whispers, the search parties, the years of unanswered questions, seemed to begin from that single picture of calm. No one in Cypress Hollow could have known that the heat that summer was more than weather. It was a warning, a heaviness pressing down on the town before the silence came. When people remember 1974, they don't talk about the disappearance first. They talk about the stillness before it, the quiet afternoons, the smell of cut grass, the way the air seemed to pause each time the twins passed by. Because sometimes the beginning of a mystery doesn't sound like thunder. It sounds like nothing at all. That summer was the last time anyone truly slept with their windows open in Cypress Hollow. August 8th, 1974, began like any other day in Cypress Hollow, bright, heavy with heat, and slow to move. The air shimmered above the asphalt, and the smell of wet grass clung to the morning from an early sprinkler cycle. In the Hollis home, the twins ate breakfast at the kitchen table, quietly as always, with sunlight sliding through the lace curtains. Margaret poured orange juice into matching glasses, humming a tune the girls had been singing all week. June asked if they could ride to the lake after lunch. Joni didn't ask at all. She just looked at her sister and smiled, as if the answer was already known between them. By noon, the town was already half asleep under the heat. Lawnmowers buzzed like mechanical cicadas, and even the dogs stayed in shade. The twins left their house around 3, their bicycles wobbling down Larkspur Street, pink ribbons tied to their handles fluttering in the thick air. Mrs. Klein, the retired schoolteacher from next door, waved to them from her porch, iced tea sweating in her hand. She would later swear that the girls waved back, though she couldn't remember if they smiled. Everything about that afternoon seemed ordinary, except for how quiet it was. The mailman, a man named Ellis, told police later that he remembered something strange, the sound of his own footsteps. Usually there's noise, he said, radios or kids or someone's mower. But that day, nothing, just me and the heat. He remembered the Hollis twins riding past into the street around 4 o'clock, their wheels crunching over the gravel toward the cypress woods. After that, he said, they vanished into the glare. As the days stretched on, a storm began building over the Gulf. Distant thunder rolled through the horizon, soft and low, like a warning too far away to matter. Margaret began pacing near the window, her eyes flicking to the clock every few minutes. The girls were usually home by 5. At 6, she stepped onto the porch, calling their names once, then again. Her voice carried down the empty street, swallowed by the wind. When the sky finally broke open with rain around 7, she dialed the sheriff's office with trembling hands. That call became the first line in the police report that would define the next decade of her life. Mother State's children failed to return home, last seen riding bicycles toward Hollow Lake. Sheriff Donnell and 2 deputies arrived within 30 minutes. They searched the immediate area with flashlights, their beams cutting through the rain. The neighbors came out too, drawn by instinct more than invitation. Some brought umbrellas, others lanterns. They spread through the street calling, June, Joni. The sound of those names echoed against wet pavement, bouncing between the houses until they no longer sounded like words, only pleading. The storm ended by midnight, but the air remained heavy, soupy with moisture. The sheriff's men combed the cypress edge with dogs until dawn, but found no tracks, only the smell of wet earth and the slow drip of rain from the trees. Margaret stood near the patrol cars the entire night, still wearing her house slippers. She didn't cry. She just watched the dark tree line, her lips moving soundlessly, as though whispering to someone she could still see. By the second day, the search had grown. Men on horseback combed the trails. Volunteers waded to the shallows of Hollow Lake. Helicopters flew overhead, blades cutting through the humidity. Nothing, not a scrap of fabric, not a tire mark, not a footprint that led anywhere. It was as if the twins had been lifted out of the world. The local paper ran the headline, "Twin Girls Missing. Search Continues," above a photo of June and Joni taken at school earlier that spring. In it, they stood shoulder to shoulder, faces almost expressionless, their eyes both fixed slightly to the left of the camera. The symmetry was uncanny, unsettling even. The caption beneath simply read, Age 9, last seen near Hollow Lake. Neighbors began telling the sheriff what they remembered. A mechanic down the street claimed he saw a white sedan parked near the lake that afternoon. A teenage girl said she'd heard a faint scream, though she couldn't tell from where. Others said nothing, not because they didn't notice, but because the unease of what they might have seen was too fragile to say out loud. As the search wore on, small details started to take root in the collective mind of the town. People recalled a black dog barking for nearly an hour before sunset, facing the woods and refusing to move. Others said they'd noticed the hollow's front door left slightly ajar around 5. Every story added to confusion, overlapping timelines, contradicting truths. By the third night, the air over Cypress Hollow felt charged, as though something unseen hovered above it. The streets glistened with leftover rain. Porch lights flickered in the humidity, and the scent of magnolia clung to the breeze. Inside her darkened home, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with both of the girls' hairbrushes in front of her, fingers tracing the wooden handles over and over. The deputies checked in hourly, but she barely spoke. When one officer gently asked her to describe the girls again, she said, "They're the same, always the same." The words unsettled him. In the days that followed, the sheriff expanded the search radius. Roadblocks were set up. The National Guard was briefly called in. Television reporters arrived from nearby counties. But nothing broke through the stillness that had settled over the town. Even nature seemed to slow down. The cicadas fell silent, the lake barely rippled, and the wind moved in strange directions. It was as if Cypress Hollow had swallowed its own sound. When night came again, the neighbors gathered on their porches, unable to sleep. From across the stillness of Larkspur Street, the faint sound of frogs rose from the lake, blending with the whine of distant power lines. Somewhere in that darkness, a searchlight swept through the trees and caught the shimmer of something metallic, a bicycle reflector, half buried in mud. The next morning, divers were sent in. They found nothing. By the end of the week, all that remained was a growing ache of unanswered questions. Margaret's curtains stayed drawn. The sheriff's men moved slower each day. And the town, the quiet, sun-drenched town that had always believed in safety, began to feel hollow inside its own name. The day the twins disappeared didn't end with screams or sirens. It ended with stillness, the same kind that had begun the summer. Only now it felt different, charged, almost listening, as though the world itself had paused to ask, how could 2 children vanish without leaving a single sound behind? In Cypress Hollow, that silence would become a memory all its own, louder somehow than anything else. In the weeks that followed, the town of Cypress Hollow began to speak, not in one voice, but in dozens of small, uneven ones. Each neighbor, each passerby, seemed to remember something slightly different about the day June and Joni vanished. And though the sheriff tried to collect their statements neatly, like puzzle pieces that might form a single truth, the more he gathered, the more the edges refused to fit. At first, the stories came softly, almost apologetically. People spoke in grocery store aisles and at church picnics, whispering as though afraid to summon something back into being. Mrs. Klein, the retired schoolteacher, was the first to go on record. She told the deputies she'd seen the twins near the lake around for that afternoon, their bicycles propped neatly against a tree. They were talking to someone, she said, fanning herself with a folded newspaper. A man with a white hat. He looked friendly enough. I didn't think twice. When the sheriff asked what kind of car he drove, she hesitated. I don't recall a car, just a hat, and a sound maybe like whistling. The mechanic, Mr. Adley, shook his head when he heard her version. There wasn't no man with a hat, he insisted. I was working at the garage till 5. You can see straight down to the lake from my window. If someone was out there, I'd have seen. His hands, still streaked with grease, trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette. What people think they see after something bad happens. It changes. Minds fill in blanks. Then there was Ruthie, the teenage girl from the next street over, who came forward a week later. She said she'd been riding home from a friend's house that evening when she heard something strange from the woods. 2 voices, she said, singing like kids' voices. I thought it was those twins playing some kind of game. When the sheriff asked what they were singing, she frowned. It didn't sound like a song I knew. Just humming, but it matched, like they were answering each other. Her mother told reporters she was only trying to help. But Ruthie stopped riding near the woods after that. Soon, stories began to multiply like humidity, thick and hard to breathe through. One neighbor claimed she saw a light moving by the lake lawn after midnight. Another swore she heard knocking sounds from the direction of the cypress grove, rhythmic and hollow. An old fisherman told the sheriff that Hollow Lake never gave back what it took. Every account contradicted the next. And yet, the more they talked, the closer the town seemed to drift towards something shared. Not truth, but unity. People gathered in clusters on porches, replaying their fragments of memory over coffee cups, their voices dipping low when the wind changed direction. Each person's story carried an invisible need beneath it, the need to have seen something, to not have missed a moment when the world quietly broke. Margaret Hollis became the subject of quieter conversations. Some pitied her, saying grief had taken her voice. Others speculated darker things. Maybe she wanted them gone. One neighbor muttered at the diner, stirring her iced tea. Maybe they weren't right to begin with. You ever notice how those girls never spoke to anyone else? The waitress hushed her, but the words stayed hanging in the air, heavier than steam. The sheriff's deputies continued to interview residents, though what they collected were not facts but emotions, guilt, fascination, unease. The official reports filled with contradictions. Witness A saw the girls at 4. Witness B saw them at 5. Witness C was certain they never left the street at all. Memory began to shift under the weight of fear. By the 3rd week, even those who had been silent began to remember something, as if the silence itself accused them of indifference. The twins became a story everyone owned a piece of. Old men at the gas station added new details each morning, details that had never existed before. Children whispered about the Hollis ghosts at recess. A pastor's wife told her Bible study that she dreamed of 2 girls knocking on her window, their hair dripping lake water. When she woke, her curtains were wet. She never told anyone outside that room, but word still spread, as rumors always do in small towns where the air feels too still. Some nights, people gathered near the lake with lanterns, not to search but to listen. The crickets would fall silent for a few seconds at a time, and in those gaps of sound, you could feel the whole town leaning in. Everyone waited for something, a voice, a splash, a sign. Nothing came. Yet afterward, when they walked home, each person swore they'd heard something faint, something they couldn't describe. The sheriff called it imagination. Others called it presence. The narrator reflects quietly here how communities build myths to survive the unbearable. When faced with emptiness, people will trade truth for meaning every time. In Cypress Hollow, the absence of the twins became too large to leave unnamed. So the town began shaping it, carving their fear into stories, their confusion into folklore. By the end of August, the words the twins no longer referred to 2 missing children. They became an idea, an echo shared between conversations. The neighbors no longer spoke of them as people, but as moments, fleeting shadows, sounds in the distance, reflections in the water that weren't quite reflections at all. The sheriff noticed it too. In his journal, he wrote, "Every story contradicts the last. Still, they all say the same thing underneath. Everyone feels watched." And that was true. As the days passed, more people began closing their blinds earlier, turning their porch lights on before sunset. The lake, once a place of laughter and swimming, grew deserted. Its surface became a mirror that no one wanted to look into. Margaret, meanwhile, stopped answering her door. She spent her evenings in the back garden, silent, her face pale against the glow of the kitchen light. When a neighbor tried to comfort her, she simply said, "They're not gone. They just changed places." No one understood what she meant, but the words settled deep into the town's collective unease. By September, Cypress Hollow had divided itself into 2 kinds of people, those who believed the twins had been taken, and those who believed they had simply left. Both sides felt righteous. Both feared the other. And in that tension, the town began to warp slightly, like a photograph left too long in the sun. The narrator's tone grows softer here, almost mournful. Truth was never the purpose of their talking. It was comfort, the only kind they could give themselves. Each retelling smoothed the edges of grief, made it bearable, even beautiful in a tragic way. But every lie, every small invention, carried a weight, and together, those weights began to sink Cypress Hollow further into itself. By the end of that month, the sheriff stopped asking what people saw. He already knew what they would say. Not the same thing, but the same feeling. That feeling, that strange certainty mixed with doubt, would linger for decades, long after the faces of the witnesses had faded. What the neighbors said shocked the town, yes. But what truly haunted it was what they didn't say, the quiet tremor beneath every memory, as though each of them feared deep down that they had seen the truth once and simply looked away. The search shifted to Hollow Lake by the end of the third week. It was inevitable. That's where all missing things in Cypress Hollow eventually seemed to end up. The water stretched out behind the town like a shadow, its edges veiled by moss and cypress trees, whose roots coiled deep into the mud. No one swam there anymore, not since the early 60s when a boy had drowned chasing a fishing line. But the twins had often been seen near the lake's rim, skipping stones and drawing shapes in the damp sand. It was where their bikes were last pointed, where the town's whispers led. The sheriff's office brought in divers from Tallahassee. They arrived before sunrise, their trucks rumbling over the gravel road as mist drifted above the water. The air smelled of iron and algae, heavy and still. Margaret Hollis stood at the fence line, a faded shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't speak, didn't even turn when people approached. She only watched the divers pull on their suits and slip below the surface, her eyes fixed on the widening circles of water. At first, hope made the silence bearable. The deputies called out coordinates. Flashlights flickered across the trees. Reporters scribbled notes in damp notebooks. Then, around noon, a deputy called out. 2 bicycles had been found half submerged near the northern bank. The town gathered within hours, crowding the shore in quiet disbelief. The bikes were identical, small, painted white, each with pink ribbons tied to the handlebars. They were tangled together beneath the shallow water, as if one had fallen, and the other had leaned close to follow. The tires were coated in silt, the chain stiff with rust. One bike still had a sticker of a smiling sun, half peeled from its frame. The deputies lifted them out carefully, laying them on the grass. A camera clicked, then another. That was when the murmuring began again. Some said the bikes looked placed, not fallen. The kickstands were both down. The front wheels pointed toward the water, parallel, perfectly aligned. "It's too neat," someone whispered. "Kids, don't park like that." Another claimed he saw footprints in the mud. Small ones, facing the lake, but too faint to cast or photograph. When the divers went back under, they found nothing else. No shoes, no hair ribbons, no bodies, only the bikes, only the silence. That evening, the sheriff held a press conference by the water. Cameras captured the flash of lightning in the distance, a storm threatening again, as if drawn by the story itself. "We are continuing the search," Sheriff Donnell said, his voice steady but tired. "At this time, there is no evidence of foul play," but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. Everyone noticed it. By nightfall, the crowd had dispersed. Margaret stayed behind long after the others left. She sat at the edge of the dock, the hem of her dress brushing the dark water. A deputy tried to walk her home, but she refused. "They're still here," she said softly. "You're just looking in the wrong way." When he asked what she meant, she looked at him, not angry, not afraid, just hollow, and said, "They always love reflections." The next morning, a group of volunteers found one of the girls' shoes caught between the roots of a cypress tree a few yards from the bikes. It was small, muddy, its buckle undone. But when they brought it to Margaret, she only shook her head. "That's not theirs," she said. The deputies insisted it matched the pair listed in the household inventory. Margaret's voice remained calm. "It's not theirs," she repeated. "My girls don't leave things behind." In the days that followed, Hollow Lake became a shrine. People came not just to search, but to stand. They brought flowers, photographs, and candles, leaving them along the shoreline. Children whispered to the water, daring each other to call the twins names. At night, the wind moved through the cypress branches like a sigh. Locals said it sounded like humming, two tones, in harmony. The narrator lingers on the atmosphere here. The way stillness turned sacred when paired with loss. The lake became more than geography. It became memory's mirror, the place where every unanswered question rippled back at the town. The surface of the water was so smooth some evenings that it reflected the sky with unnerving clarity. The clouds, the moon, even a faint outline of trees. Looking into it felt like looking into another version of Cypress Hollow, one quieter, slower, and empty of life. Divers returned twice more over the next month. They mapped the bottom of the lake, pulling up broken branches, empty bottles, and the skeleton of an old rowboat. But they never found the twins. Sheriff Donnell stopped the official searches after 45 days. The cost was mounting. The leads were gone, and the weight of uncertainty had begun to choke the town's rhythm. The church bells rang one final time for the girls that October. After that, silence became the only memorial. But rumors filled the silence quickly. One man said he saw Margaret walk into the lake each night at dusk, barefoot, her dress trailing in the water. Another swore she could be heard whispering the girls' names into the wind. When questioned, she neither confirmed nor denied it. The only statement she ever gave was simple: "They're not gone. They're waiting." From that point, the town began to turn inward. People started avoiding the lake altogether. The sound of frogs and insects at night became unbearable to some. They said it carried a rhythm that matched the twins' laughter. Fishermen moved their boats to other lakes. The diner by the water shut down by Christmas. Even the teenagers stopped coming there to drink or tell ghost stories. Hollow Lake no longer belonged to anyone. The narrator's voice slows, tracing the emotional decay that began to spread. The disappearance no longer felt like an isolated tragedy. It had become an infection, something that seeped into the soil and the air. Houses near the water went unsold. Curtains stayed drawn longer each day. The hum of normal life, the distant music, the laughter, the sound of lawnmowers faded into memory. And still, there were nights when someone swore they saw a movement near the lake. Two small figures walking along the edge, hand in hand, always just before dawn, always vanishing when called to. The sheriff dismissed these sightings as tricks of light, but deep down, everyone in Cypress Hollow carried the same thought they couldn't quite say aloud. Maybe what disappeared that August wasn't only the twins. Maybe it was something inside the town itself, something reflected too clearly in the water and then lost beneath it. From then on, Hollow Lake remained untouched, a mirror for everything that couldn't be explained. And when the wind moved through the cypress trees, it sounded like two voices calling softly, not for help, but for silence. Winter came early to Cypress Hollow that year. The first frost touched the windows before Thanksgiving, and with it came a silence heavier than before. The search had ended, but the questions hadn't. The official narrative was clear enough: missing, presumed drowned. Yet the town couldn't swallow it. People still locked their doors earlier. Children still refused to walk past the old fence by Hollow Lake, and Margaret Hollis's house remained both a landmark and a warning. Neighbors described her as quiet but strange. They said she stopped answering the phone, stopped attending church, stopped waving from her porch. Yet every morning, smoke rose from her chimney, and once a week she left the house, always at dusk, always walking down toward the lake road, a lantern in hand. Some said she carried a basket, others a small box wrapped in cloth. No one knew what was inside, and no one was brave enough to ask. By January, curiosity turned to concern. The Hollis house had started to decay at its edges. Paint peeled, the yard overgrew, and the swings that the twins had once used sagged in the cold air, its chains creaking when the wind moved. The sight of that swing, empty but shifting gently, unsettled even those who didn't believe in ghosts. That's when the neighbors began to talk, and their stories would change everything. The first was an older woman, Mrs. Langford, who lived across the street. She told the sheriff she'd seen lights in the twins' bedroom window late at night. Not the steady glow of a lamp, but a faint flicker like candlelight. It danced, she said, softly, and sometimes I'd swear I saw two shadows moving behind the curtain. The sheriff didn't take a report. He said grief does strange things to the eyes. But then came more accounts. A paper boy claimed he heard whispering when he tossed a newspaper onto the Hollis porch. A mail carrier said he saw drawings appear in the frost of the window, twin shapes, holding hands. And one night, a neighbor swore he heard laughter, faint, echoing unmistakably young, drifting across the yard. When he looked, the light in the twins' window vanished. By February, the stories had spread through the diner, the post office, and the church pews. Some believed Margaret was summoning her daughters. Others thought the house itself had turned restless. The sheriff grew irritated at the gossip, but couldn't stop it. In a town as small as Cypress Hollow, rumors were as natural as air. They filled whatever space silence left behind. Then something happened that made the whispers impossible to ignore. One morning, Margaret's front door was found wide open. A neighbor named Calvin Reed noticed it on his way to work. The cold wind blowing through, curtains lifting slightly in the draft. He called out her name, but got no response. The police were summoned. Inside, the house was eerily clean. The dishes were washed, the beds made, the twins' room neat as though they'd just stepped outside to play. But the oddest detail lay on the kitchen table. There were 2 plates set, each with a glass of milk beside it. Half full. The milk had not yet spoiled. Margaret wasn't home, but she returned at sunset. When Sheriff Donnell asked her about it, she smiled faintly and said they were hungry last night. He tried to question her further, but she would not elaborate. That phrase, "they were hungry last night," spread through the town like a chill draft. By the next morning, every person had heard it. Some laughed nervously. Others refused to speak of it at all. In the weeks that followed, strange sounds continued around the Hollis property. Dogs barked at nothing. The air inside the house was said to smell faintly of lilies and river water. One boy dared another to touch the front gate. He said it felt warm, even on the coldest morning. Margaret herself became thinner, her eyes distant, her movements slower, like she was listening for something only she could hear. The narrator's voice deepens here, turning the story inward, not toward the supernatural, but toward the psychological. Isolation bends perception. Grief reshapes time. Margaret was living in a space where days and nights blended together, where the dead seemed only a breath away. A social worker was sent by the county to check on her. Her report was brief. Home tidy, subject calm, no immediate concerns. Mentions daughters in present tense. When the sheriff read it, he circled that last line 3 times. That spring, the whispers evolved into something else. Not gossip now, but belief. People began leaving small gifts by her gate. Dolls, hair ribbons, flowers. They didn't do it for Margaret, but for the twins. As though feeding a ghost might ease the weight pressing on the town. But belief has its own momentum. A man named Earl Jensen, who ran the gas station, claimed he saw Margaret standing at her window, talking softly to 2 figures just beyond the glass. It wasn't a reflection, he insisted. They were outside near the swing. Others dismissed him, but a few admitted they'd seen the same shapes. Pale, almost luminous, moving together in the dusk light. The sheriff wanted to call it hysteria, but deep down he wasn't sure anymore. Every visit to the Hollis house felt colder, emptier. He started keeping his visits short. Even he couldn't shake the feeling that the place watched. The section closes with an image, the camera slowly panning across the empty street, the faint hum of insects rising as dusk falls. The Hollis house sits in shadow, one window still faintly lit. Inside, Margaret stands by the sill, her hands resting on the glass. Outside, 2 empty swings move slightly in the breeze, perfectly in rhythm, as if something unseen has returned to finish what the town could not understand. From this point forward, the story will begin to blur the line between memory, madness, and haunting. Not as proof of the supernatural, but as a mirror of grief so deep it alters the world around it. Spring arrived with an unnatural stillness that year, the kind that makes you feel as if the world itself is holding its breath. Cypress Hollow, once alive with porch talk and hum of radios, had grown quieter. People still drove to work, still cut their lawns, still gathered at the grocery store, but their eyes lingered longer on the Hollis house, and conversations trailed off when its name surfaced. The twins' disappearance had stopped being news. It had become folklore. Folklore, though, has a way of reshaping truth. And by April, the story everyone thought they knew began to change. It started with a letter, a faded envelope, no return address, slid beneath the sheriff's office door one morning. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice, smelling faintly of rain. The handwriting was neat but uneven, like someone writing through tremors. It read, "You're all looking the wrong place. The girls didn't go into the water. They went where the light ends. Ask the man by the church, the one who used to fix clocks. He saw them. He knows." Sheriff Donnell read it twice before folding it back up. He didn't tell the press. He'd learned by now that this town fed too easily on mystery, and every rumor sprouted 3 more by sunrise. Still, something in the phrasing unsettled him, where the light ends. He locked the note in his desk drawer, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. That afternoon, he drove to the small repair shop beside St. Agnes Church. It had been closed for years, the windows fogged with dust. But the man who used to fix clocks was still there, Harold Pine, a thin, soft-spoken veteran who rarely left the building. His wife had died decades earlier, and since then he lived surrounded by the sound of ticking. When Donnell asked him about the twins, Harold hesitated. His eyes drifted toward the back window, where the view stretched toward Hollow Lake. "I didn't see them go in," he said quietly. "I saw them walk past, just before sunset, the day they disappeared." "Walk past where?" the sheriff asked. Harold pointed to the tree line. They weren't heading toward the lake. They were heading east, toward the woods behind the old transmission tower. I called out, but they didn't answer. They looked wrong somehow, like they were following something I couldn't see. Donnell pressed further, but Harold clammed up. The old man's hands trembled as he wound the clock. "It's not good to follow the sound when it's not calling you," he muttered. "They did." The sheriff left unsettled. The woods behind the tower were private property, dense, overgrown, and rarely visited. He'd written them off early in the investigation because no trails led through them. But now, months later, the idea fell heavier. He drove out that evening, just as the light began to fade. The drive was long and lonely. Pines pressed close to the road, and the air seemed thicker the deeper he went. When he finally reached the clearing near the old tower, he parked and stepped out. The silence hit him immediately. No birds, no insects, just wind brushing through dry leaves. He found faint signs of movement, a small indentation in the ground, too old to cast properly, and a tattered ribbon tangled in a thorn bush. Pink, faded but unmistakable. His pulse quickened. He bagged the ribbon and marked the spot, returning at dawn with 2 deputies and a forensic team. They combed the woods for hours, but found nothing else. No clothing, no footprints, no remains. Just a ribbon, a patch of disturbed soil, and a lingering feeling that they weren't alone. By the time they returned to town, word had already leaked. Someone had seen the sheriff's car out near the tower. Rumors erupted again, louder than ever. Some said the twins were found alive. Others claimed their spirits haunted the trees. A few whispered that the sheriff was hiding something, that maybe the truth wasn't meant to be found. Margaret Hollis didn't come to the door when Donnell visited that evening, but he saw a movement to the curtain, a shadow gliding across the window, smaller than hers. He froze, his throat tightening. It wasn't possible. When she finally opened the door, she looked composed, almost serene. "They were never in the lake," she said before he could speak. Her voice was calm, but her eyes seemed distant, reflecting something invisible. The lake was only where people wanted them to be. Easier that way. The sheriff asked how she knew. She smiled faintly. Mothers always know where their children are, even when the rest of the world forgets. That night, the sheriff couldn't sleep. He replayed Harold's words, the image of the pink ribbon and Margaret's quiet certainty. His mind began to circle around the phrase from the letter, where the light ends. The narrator's tone deepens here, layering dread with revelation. Cypress Hollow is no longer just a setting. It becomes a living organism, pulsing with secrets, feeding on memory. The more the sheriff uncovers, the more the truth slips through his hands. Days later, another letter arrived. Same handwriting, same paper. You're close. But the mother's truth is not the same as the town's. The girls remember differently. This time, Donnell didn't hide it. He brought the letter to Margaret. She read it slowly, her lips tightening. "They're right," she said softly. The girls remembered differently. "Who sent this?" he asked. She looked up at him, eyes glistening. "Someone who listens to them." That was the first time anyone heard Margaret speak of her daughters as if they were still talking to her, not through dreams, not through memory, through presence. In the nights that followed, lights flickered again in her windows. The townsfolk started keeping their distance. The air around Hollis' property felt charged, like before a storm. The camera lingers on this tension. The soft hum of insects, the glow of the house and the moon, the sheriff's silhouette watching from a road. Inside, Margaret moves slowly through the hallway, whispering something we can't hear. 2 plates rest again on the kitchen table. 2 glasses. And faintly, from somewhere deeper in the house, comes the sound of a child's laugh, brief, light, and gone too soon. From here, the story begins to shift from disappearance into revelation. Not of what happened, but of what remains. By summer, the town had settled into a rhythm of unease. Life went on. Children rode their bikes down Main Street. The church bells still toll on Sundays. The diner reopened under new management. But strange energy hovered above everything. It was in the way conversations paused when someone mentioned the Hollis house, or how people walked a little faster when passing the Lake Road. Cypress Hollow wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It was haunted by its own memory. The sheriff, exhausted by sleepless nights, began revisiting his old case notes. The letters had stopped arriving. The woods behind the tower yielded nothing new. Every lead had turned to dust. Yet the unease inside him kept growing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished, that the case wasn't closed, only buried beneath time and silence. He started visiting Margaret again, quietly, every few weeks. She didn't resist. She would offer him tea, sit at her kitchen table and talk in fragments, not about the twins' disappearance, but about their lives before it, their habits, their voices, their small, specific rituals. "They used to play a game," she said one evening. They called it mirror time. They'd stand in front of the hallway mirror at sunset and whisper questions. They said the mirror knew things. It would tell them who was thinking of them, or where their lost toys were. I never encouraged it, but... She trailed off, eyes distant. It always gave them the right answers. The sheriff wrote it down, though he didn't know why. After that, Margaret seemed lighter for a while. The curtains opened again. Fresh flowers appeared in the windows. But then, in late July, something shifted. The postman, delivering mail at dusk, said he heard 2 voices inside the house. One was Margaret's. The other was high-pitched, lilting, unmistakably a child's. When he mentioned it to the sheriff, Donnell brushed it off. But that night, he drove by the Hollis property and saw a faint movement in the front window. 2 shapes, one tall, one small, standing side by side. The curtain closed before he could be sure. A week later, a new rumor surfaced that the twins had been seen again, not near the lake this time, but by the old playground on Cypress Lane. A teenager swore she saw them in the fog, 2 little girls in white dresses, holding hands, walking slowly past the swings. When she called out, they turned in unison. "They looked right at me," she said, trembling, but their faces didn't look right, like they weren't finished. The town didn't believe her, not fully, but the story spread anyway. Within days, more people claimed to have seen them. 2 figures near the woods. 2 shapes reflected in a window. 2 voices humming near the church steps. The twins had returned, not as ghosts, not as flesh, but as presence. The narrator lingers here, describing the way small towns metabolize fear. Cypress Hollow didn't know whether to believe or deny what it was seeing, so it did both. It lived in contradiction. One half convinced of haunting, the other half desperate to call it coincidence. But beneath it all, an older instinct stirred, that the truth, whatever it was, still lay buried somewhere between the living and the dead. Sheriff Donnell began walking at night, tracing old paths, watching for signs. He would pass the diner, crossed the train tracks, and ended the lake, where the water reflected only darkness. He started hearing things too, faint laughter, distant footsteps, the rustle of fabric behind him. He told himself it was wind. He told himself many things. Then one night he saw her. Margaret stood by the lake, barefoot, her nightgown clinging to her legs. She held something in her hands, a small box wrapped in fabric, just like the neighbors had said. The moonlight glimmered off the water, casting her reflection long and thin. He called her name, softly at first, then louder. She didn't turn. She knelt down and placed the box at the edge of the water. Her lips moved, though no sound carried. Then she let the box slide forward. It drifted a few inches, tipped, and sank. When she finally turned toward him, her face was pale, wet with tears. "They're safe now," she whispered. The sheriff walked her home. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of lilies again. On the mantelpiece sat 2 framed photographs. The twins smiling, their hair tied with pink ribbons. He noticed something he hadn't before. In one of the photos, taken at the fair the summer before they vanished, a man's shadow stretched behind them. Tall, thin, out of place. He'd been cropped out halfway. "Who's that?" he asked quietly. Margaret hesitated. "A friend," she said. "He used to help fix things around the house. The girls liked him." "What was his name?" Her eyes flickered, uncertain. "I don't remember," she said, almost to herself. That night, the sheriff dug through the original witness statements. One mentioned a handyman, a drifter who'd been staying on the outskirts of town that summer, hired by a few locals for small jobs. Never seen again after August 14th, the day before the twins disappeared. The sheriff's heart sank. How had he missed it? Or had he simply wanted to? He stayed up until dawn reading through the old files, the sound of the ticking clock echoing in his kitchen like a countdown. At sunrise, he drove to Margaret's again. The curtains were open, but the house was still. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air was cold. The kitchen table was set for 3. Margaret was gone. The neighbors hadn't seen her leave. No one had. But that morning, just as the church bells began to ring, 2 small sets of footprints appeared on the wet ground outside her gate, side by side, leading away toward the woods. The sheriff followed them until they faded. The prints were too perfect, too deliberate, as if someone had placed them there for him to find. When he reached the edge of the forest, the air changed, cooler, quieter. He called out once, twice. No answer, only the faint sound of wind through leaves. The section closes on this image. The sheriff standing alone at the tree line, breath visible in the dawn air, the first light catching the edges of the woods. Behind him, the town still sleeps. Ahead of him, the trees wait, still and endless. Somewhere within them, perhaps, the truth lingers, waiting for someone brave or broken enough to step beyond the edge of the light. And for the first time since that summer in 1974, Sheriff Donnell takes a step forward. The woods east of Cypress Hollow were older than the town itself. Locals called them the Verge, a place where sunlight filtered in fractured beams, and the air always felt cooler, even at noon. As Sheriff Donnell stepped into that dim stillness, the world behind him seemed to dissolve. The hum of the highway faded. The smell of asphalt gave way to earth, pine, and something faintly metallic. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He had brought a flashlight, but the batteries flickered as soon as he switched it on. Still, he pressed forward. The ground was soft with moss, his boots sinking slightly with each step. Cobwebs brushed against his face. Every few yards, he stopped to listen, but there was nothing, only the sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. He followed the faint impression of footprints deeper into the trees. They grew smaller, lighter, then vanished completely near a clearing. There in the center, he found something strange, a circle of stones, perfectly arranged. Inside it, the grass was burned away, leaving a patch of bare soil. He crouched and touched the ground, cold, though the air was warm. Something about the pattern felt deliberate. He had seen makeshift fire pits before, teenagers, hunters, campers. But this was different. The stones were uniform, evenly spaced, as if measured. In the center, half buried beneath dirt, was a shard of glass. He pulled it free and turned it in the light. It wasn't glass at all. It was mirror. The fragment caught the dim sunlight and reflected it faintly, fractured into smaller beams that flickered across the trees. For a moment, he thought he saw movement within the reflection, a shape, small and shifting. He blinked, and it was gone. He pocketed the shard, marking the circle with a piece of cloth, then turned back. But the wood seemed different now. Paths splitting where there had been none, roots twisting in unfamiliar ways. He'd walked maybe a quarter mile, yet when he checked his watch, nearly 2 hours had passed. By the time he emerged from the trees, the sky had dimmed toward evening. His car sat where he'd left it, dusted with pollen, as if waiting too long. He drove straight to the station, his hands tight on the wheel. The town looked the same, but he no longer felt inside it. That night, he studied the mirror fragment under a desk lamp. Its edges were jagged, and on the back, faint residue with glue and wallpaper. He realized it wasn't from the woods. It was from inside a house. He called the records office, asking for the original Hollis home inventory. The twins' bedroom mirror had indeed been noted. Oval-shaped, cracked near the frame. Missing piece, lower right. His pulse quickened. He drove to the Hollis house at midnight. The front gate creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was heavy, humid, filled with that familiar scent of lilies and damp soil. The living room looked untouched. Same photos, same furniture. But something had changed. The mirror in the hallway, where the girls had once played Mirror Time, was covered with a bedsheet. He hesitated, then pulled it off. The mirror was whole, no missing fragment. No crack. Its surface gleamed faintly despite the low light, too polished for a mirror that should have aged. His reflection wavered, shifting slightly behind his own movements, like a delay. He stared, heart pounding. Then, just beneath his reflection, something else moved, a flicker of color, pale and fast, like fabric fluttering. He stepped back, nearly dropping his flashlight. The hallway behind him was empty. He covered the mirror again and left. Back at the station, he tried to write a report, but every sentence felt wrong. Object recovered from possible scene. He typed, then deleted it. Mirror fragment connected to missing minors, then deleted that too. How do you write about something that doesn't fit the language of evidence? The next day, he took the fragment to Harold Pine, the clockmaker. The old man studied it for a long time, holding up to the light. "You shouldn't keep this," he said quietly. "Mirrors remember things, especially the old ones." "What does that mean?" Harold placed the shard on the counter carefully. "Time isn't straight here. Not in this town. It loops back on itself, always to the moment it can't forget." The sheriff stared at him, but Harold said nothing more. The shop filled with the sound of clocks ticking, hundreds of overlapping rhythms, none of them perfectly in sync. That evening, the sheriff returned home. He poured himself coffee and stared out the window. Across the street, something caught his eye, a flicker in the glass of his neighbor's car window. For an instant, he saw 2 figures standing behind him in the reflection, small, unmoving. When he turned, the room was empty. He didn't sleep. The narrator's tone here grows slower, almost dreamlike, as if time itself begins to fracture. The boundary between grief, memory, and haunting starts to dissolve. The mystery is no longer about the missing twins. It's about what they left behind and what they took with them. The following morning, the sheriff drove to Hollow Lake one last time. Mist rolled across the surface, blurring the horizon. He stood at the edge, the same spot where the bikes had been found, and took the mirror shard from his pocket. Its surface caught the gray light. For a moment, he thought he saw their faces again. Twin silhouettes reflected beside his own. He whispered their names. The wind rippled the water. And then, faintly, he heard a sound. 2 voices, overlapping, soft, distant, but unmistakably human. They weren't crying. They were laughing. He dropped the shard. It hit the water with a dull splash, sinking quickly out of sight. That night, the sound of laughter drifted through town again. Some said it came from the lake. Others swore it came from the woods. But Margaret's house stayed dark. No lights in the window, no movement behind the curtains. Only the mirror, still covered, waiting. And somewhere deep in the verge, Among the trees and stone circle, a faint reflection shimmered on a fragment half buried in the dirt, catching the moonlight and showing, for a second, two small hands reaching outward. Then the darkness folded in again, and the woods swallowed the light. In the days that followed, Cypress Hollow began to change in subtle but unmistakable ways. It wasn't that people vanished or that strange lights appeared in the sky. Nothing so loud or cinematic. The change came softly, like fog rolling to the town, touching everything but leaving no clear sign of where it had been. The clocks in the diner began losing time. Streetlights flickered in perfect rhythm, then steadied again. Dogs barked at windows with no movement beyond them. And though no one said out loud, everyone felt it, that slow, humming sense that something unseen had stepped closer. Sheriff Donnell barely slept. Every night, he would wake to the faint ticking of something, a rhythm that didn't belong to any clock in his house. It was softer, uneven, like a heartbeat out of sync with his own. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he'd see flashes. The circle of stones in the forest, the shimmer of water, the pale outlines of two small figures standing just beyond reach. He would wake drenched in sweat, unsure if he'd been dreaming or remembering. On the third morning, he returned to the woods, this time with Deputy Laura Keene. She was young, skeptical, and didn't like the way he spoke about echoes or memories that hold on. But she followed him anyway, her flashlight cutting through the dense fog that pooled between the trees. They found the circle again, or something that looked like it. The stones were still there, but now the center was filled with stagnant water, black and still, reflecting the canopy above like a perfect mirror. Laura crouched beside it, frowning. Looks like rainwater. He shook his head. It hasn't rained in 4 days. She dipped a finger in and jerked back immediately. It's freezing. He leaned closer. His reflection wavered on the surface, fragmented by the faint ripples she'd made. For a moment, another shape appeared beside him in the reflection. Two silhouettes standing where no one stood. He blinked, and they were gone. Laura stood, brushing her hands off. You think this has something to do with the Hollis case? He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled the second mirror fragment from his pocket, the one he recovered from Margaret's house before the coroner sealed it. He dropped it gently into the pool. The surface rippled once, twice, then still completely. They waited. Nothing happened. No light, no sound, only the faint rustle of wind through the trees. But then, from somewhere deep in the woods, came a faint echo, laughter, childlike, high and distant. Laura turned sharply. Did you hear that? He nodded. They followed the sound. It led them off the path, over fallen logs and damp moss, until they reached a narrow stream that fed into Hollow Lake. There, half buried in the mud, was a wooden box, small and worn. The sheriff knelt and brushed away the dirt. The lid was carved with initials, E.H. and L.H., Evelyn and Lila Hollis. Laura swallowed hard. It's theirs. Inside were 3 things: a broken wristwatch, a page torn from a children's storybook, and a small silver key. The page showed a drawing of 2 girls standing before a mirror, their reflections smiling back at them. But something about the reflection was wrong. The eyes of the girls inside the mirror were open wider, too wide, and the smiles too sharp. The sheriff stared at it for a long time. They drew this, he said quietly. I've seen this book. It was in their room. Laura shivered. Then why is it out here? He didn't answer. He just looked at the page, his thumb tracing the uneven edge where it had been torn. The longer he looked, the more he felt that faint hum again, the same low vibration he'd heard in his dreams, the same ticking rhythm that seemed to follow him now wherever he went. They brought the box back to the station, logging it as evidence. But when he opened it again later that night, the page was blank. No drawing, no color, only faint impressions where the pencil lines had been pressed into the paper. The key and the watch were the same, but the story had vanished. That night, he sat in his office with the page under the lamp, staring at the faint indentations. He ran a pencil sideways over it, hoping to reveal the marks. Slowly, lines began to reappear, but they weren't the same as before. Now, the 2 girls stood not before the mirror, but behind it. Their hands pressed against the glass from the other side. His breath caught. He turned the paper over, but the back was blank. When he looked again, the drawer had changed once more. This time, only one girl remained, the other gone, leaving a faint smear where she had been. He locked the evidence drawer and walked out into the cool night air. The moon hung low, full and pale, its reflection stretching across Hollow Lake in the distance. The air smelled of wet soil and rust. He could hear the faint ticking again, not from his watch, not from the station clock, but from somewhere in the trees, a slow, steady pulse. And then he saw it, a single light glowing faintly near the edge of the lake. He followed it down the dirt path, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The glow wasn't from a lantern or a flashlight. It was from beneath the water. Something shimmered below the surface, moving slowly, almost rhythmically, like a heartbeat of light. He knelt, his reflection quivering on the surface. For a moment, the ripples aligned, and in that reflection, he saw two small faces beside his own, Evelyn and Lila. Their expressions were calm, almost peaceful. One of them mouthed something, but he couldn't hear. Then the water darkened. The light sank, fading into the depths, and the reflection was gone. He stood there a long time, the cold air cutting through his coat. Back in town, the clocks all stopped at the same moment, 2:14 a.m. And though the sheriff didn't know it yet, that was the exact minute the Hollis twins had been reported missing all those years ago. Something had looped back. Something had begun again. The town slept unaware, wrapped in the quiet rhythm of its own forgetting. But in the woods and the water and in the mirrors of every darkened home, faint reflections stirred, waiting for morning, waiting to be seen again. Morning came slow and uneasy over Cypress Hollow. A thin mist hung over the fields, the kind that made the world look half awake, half dreaming. The sun tried to push through, but its light felt weak, filtered through something heavier than fog. Sheriff Donnell sat in his truck at the edge of Hollow Lake, the engine off, the silence absolute except for the occasional creak of cooling metal. He hadn't gone home that night. His uniform still smelled faintly of smoke and wet earth. He'd stayed there by the water until dawn, watching the surface settle into glass again, trying to convince himself that what he'd seen was nothing more than exhaustion, that the two faces had been tricks of reflection, of grief he'd absorbed from the town. But when he looked in the mirror on his dashboard, he swore for a heartbeat he saw something behind his own reflection, a soft blur of movement, like someone leaning forward to whisper. He blinked, and it was gone. That morning, Cypress Hollow woke to a sound none of them could place, a faint hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. Some said it was power lines. Others said it was just the wind, but it persisted, low and steady, like something pulsing beneath the town. At the diner, people spoke in hushed tones, their words brittle and sharp. The waitress, Ellie Moore, said her bathroom mirror had fogged up overnight, and when she wiped it clear, she saw small handprints, too low for an adult, too wide apart for a single child. Another man claimed the swing set in the old Hollis yard had started moving again, even though there hadn't been wind in days. By mid-afternoon, a sense of unease had settled across the town like dust. The sheriff tried to maintain order, stopping by the diner, speaking softly, assuring people that old houses creak, that glass fogs on its own. But his words sounded hollow even to him. When he returned to the station, Deputy Laura Keene was waiting at his desk, holding a small envelope. Her face was pale. "You should see this," she said quietly. The envelope had no return address. Inside was a single photograph, an old Polaroid, edges curled, the image slightly yellowed. It showed the twins, Evelyn and Lila, standing near the edge of the woods. They were barefoot, their hair tied with ribbons, their dresses white. Behind them, faint but visible, was a reflection of water, though the background should have been forest. Someone had written on the bottom in faded ink, "Taken March 3rd, 1974. That was 3 days after their disappearance. The sheriff turned the photo over. Scrawled on the back in shaky handwriting were 6 words. "The mirror shows what memory hides." He stared at it a long time, his thumb tracing the faded ink. That night, he returned to the Hollis house, alone this time. The front door was locked, but the key he'd taken from the evidence box. The silver one from the twins' box in the forest fit perfectly into the door's old keyhole. It turned with a soft click. Inside, the air was thick, untouched. The scent of lilies and damp wood hung heavy, the same smell that had lingered since Margaret's death. The house felt preserved, not decayed, but waiting. He walked through each room, the sound of his boots muffled by dust. In the living room, he found something he hadn't noticed before, a narrow crack running behind the wallpaper, perfectly vertical, like a line drawn by a careful hand. It extended from the ceiling to the floor, stopping just above the baseboard. He pulled the paper back and froze. Behind it was glass, a wall-sized mirror, sealed beneath years of layered wallpaper. The surface was dim, almost smoky, but still reflective. He stepped closer. The mirror didn't reflect the room as it should. The angles were wrong. The furniture slightly shifted, the lighting warmer, softer, almost alive. And in that reflection, he saw the outline of two figures sitting on the floor, playing quietly. He whispered, "Evelyn? Lila?" The figures froze. Slowly, they turned toward him. Their faces were pale, eyes wide, their expressions calm but unreadable. The sheriff's hand trembled as he reached toward the glass. His fingertips met the surface, and for a brief second, it felt warm like human skin. Then the warmth vanished. The glass went cold. He stumbled back, breathing hard. The reflection was empty again. Only his own figure stared back now, alone in the dim room. But on the inside of the mirror, faintly, like a breath against fog, two small handprints appeared. He backed away, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. He left the house, locking it behind him, the key still in his pocket. When he reached his truck, he found something resting on the hood. Another Polaroid, identical in size and color to first. But this one showed the Hollis house as it looked now, empty and aged. In one of the windows, though, two faint faces were visible looking out. He turned the photo over, written on the back in the same shaky handwriting. Not all reflections wait to be found. The sheriff looked toward the house. The curtains in the window moved slightly, though there was no breeze. He didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table, the photograph spread before him, the hum still low in his ears. It wasn't just sound now, it was rhythm. 2 beats. Pause. 2 beats. Like footsteps, or a heartbeat shared by two. By morning, he'd made his decision. He gathered every piece of evidence, the photographs, the key, the fragment of mirror, the children's drawing, and packed them into a box. He drove to Hollow Lake and stood at its edge, watching the fog lift off the water. He didn't know what he believed anymore, only that something in Cypress Hollow had never left and maybe never would. He opened the box and, one by one, dropped the items into the lake. The mirror fragment sank first, glinting faintly as it fell. Then the key, then the drawings. Finally, the photographs, which floated for a few seconds before the water soaked through and pulled them down. As the last one disappeared, the water stilled completely. No wind, no ripples, just silence. He waited for a sign, light, sound, anything, but there was nothing. He turned to leave. Behind him, just as his boots touched the path, came the faintest sound, the creak of a swing. He looked back. The old Hollis yard, visible across the field, was empty. The swing moved once, slowly forward, then back. He stood there until it stopped. The hum faded, and for the first time in months, the town of Cypress Hollow slept soundly. But somewhere beneath the water's surface, in the stillness of Hollow Lake, something faint shimmered, like a reflection waiting to rise again. 2 shapes, hand in hand, walking deeper into the dark, leaving only ripples behind. Night fell over Cypress Hollow like a closing curtain. The air was colder now, the kind of cold that clings to breath and memory alike. Sheriff Donnell parked near Hollow Lake, the same spot where a year earlier the twins' shoes had been found. He wasn't there officially anymore. The case had been closed for months, but something in him couldn't let go. Across the lake, a faint light flickered. A lantern's glow, soft and rhythmic. It moved slowly along the water's edge, swaying like someone searching. He followed the light, boots sinking into damp earth. When he got closer, he saw her, Margaret Hollis, standing knee-deep in the shallows, the lantern in one hand, her dress darkened by water. She was whispering softly, as if speaking to someone just beneath the surface. "Margaret," he called. She didn't turn. The whispers continued, her tone tender, almost motherly. Then she looked up, her eyes reflecting both the lantern's flame and something deeper, colder. "They're here," she said. "They've been here all along." The sheriff's flashlight shook in his hand. The water rippled beside her, just once. 2 small circles spreading outward, perfectly even. He blinked, and they were gone. Margaret stepped back toward the shore, handed him the lantern, and whispered, "You'll see them, too, when you listen." Then she walked past him, barefoot, leaving wet prints on the dirt path. He turned back to the water. The lantern's reflection trembled on the surface, and for a heartbeat it wasn't alone. 2 smaller glows shimmered beside it, perfectly still, before vanishing into the lake's black. The sheriff stood there until dawn, the light in his hands fading to smoke. Morning came gray and heavy over Cypress Hollow. The sheriff sat at his kitchen table, coffee untouched, staring at the small mirror across the room. Faint handprints lingered on its fog surface, too small to be his. When he reached out, the glass was icy, as though something pressed on the other side. By noon, he was back at the old Hollis house. Dust floated through still air. The rooms were unchanged, yet everything felt aware, like the house itself was listening. In the twins' closet, he found a cracked snow globe of Hollow Lake. Scratched on its base were 4 faint words. "We live in the quiet." Outside, fog rolled across the field. A whisper, laughter, light and distant, pulled him toward the lake. At the shore, something silver gleamed. A locket. Inside, the twins' faces, palms pressed together like mirrors. Behind them, Margaret Hollis. The sheriff looked into the water. Ripples spread in perfect circles, forming a reflection that wasn't his own. Beneath the surface shimmered rooms and figures, distorted versions of the Hollis home. The twins stood there, hands joined, smiling. Then, faintly, Margaret's voice, "Come see." He stepped back as the image dissolved. Fog thickened, swallowing the path, the trees, the world. A figure appeared within it, Margaret herself, pale and calm. "They never left," she whispered. "You just stopped looking." And then she was gone. The sheriff stared into the lake one last time. The surface was still again, reflecting only the dull sky. Yet when he turned to leave, he caught his reflection in the truck's mirror, his face and 2 small figures beside him. The laughter came once more, soft and distant, echoing through the mist.